well-qualified observers have described to me that you will go down in history in the kind of pantheon of great corruption fighters in this country alongside Wood and Fitzgerald. What are your reflections on the significance of your achievements?
Oh, well, that's a very flattering remark, and it's not for me to comment on that. The achievements, well, what really made me content when I left was that when I did go, I thought that ICAC was a highly professional, dedicated and skilled corruption agency. I think for my part is the high point of whatever I achieved there.
What was any low point for you? Did you have moments of uncertainty or doubt, or any other low point you might want to describe?
Well, the low point was being sued by Mr. Travers Duncan, who alleged that what I had done in communicating with the government gave rise to a perception of bias. Something like that had never happened to me in my career, and it was something very different to what I had to deal with.
And what was the outcome?
He lost. It went to 3 courts and he lost before every judge in every court. That didn't mean that it was a breeze. But there's no doubt in my mind that Operation Jasper was the most important operation that ICAC conducted while I was there. There is something about Operation Jasper that I think that I can be proud of, or that ICAC can be proud of. It all started from a report by a prisoner who simply told ICAC that there were strong rumours in the Bylong Valley that somebody had made a great deal of money from inside information about coal. And from that little acorn, a pretty large oak tree grew.
I mean, what was the process? How did that small kernel of information become what it became?
Well, there's a standard process in ICAC. That information went to the assessment division of ICAC. It was decided that potentially this was so important that even though we had such sparse information, it should be investigated further. That went to the investigation division for what is termed in-house as a preliminary investigation. When the preliminary investigation took place, there seemed to be a great potential for discovering the most serious corrupt conduct. It then went to a full investigation. We realised that we couldn't do this without extra money. So I then went to see the Premier, asked for extra money, and I must say got every possible support that we wanted, got as much money as we wanted, and got an enormous amount of help from the Auditor General, Mr. Achterstraat, who was then the Auditor General, and also the Attorney General, Mr. Smith. Staff were seconded from the Attorney General staff, staff were seconded from the Auditor General staff, and together with our own investigators, they worked enormously hard and with great skill and dedication to unearth corruption that had been very, very carefully concealed.
Other investigators talk about the risk of an empty rabbit hole, that you could embark on a great forensic examination and not turn anything up. Was that
Undoubtedly, that's so.
Tell me your reflections on that.
Well, whenever one decides to investigate anything, one has to balance the cost of investigating, coupled with the risk of not finding anything out, against the benefits to the state if you do find something out, you just have to, that has to be weighed together, and a decision has to be made. There's always a risk in starting an investigation that the money you're going to spend on it will go down the drain. But to me, the potential corruption was so serious that I thought that it was worth spending whatever money it took to work out what had happened.
Why is it that lobbying presents any kind of corruption risk in your view?
Well, honest lobbying is a very important part of our democratic system, because that's how people are able to put their views to the members of Parliament. The real problem with lobbying is where the lobbyists promise a reward to the politician if their lobbying is successful. And the reward can be anything, financial, shares in a company, a trip to the Gold Coast. That's the typical thing that we find. And that's simply bribery. That's basically corrupt. Now, corruption of this kind always takes place secretly. Nothing in writing, behind closed doors. It's very difficult to detect. And that is the grave danger of uncontrolled lobbying.
The lobbying inquiry was unusual insofar as it was not targeting a particular instance, but rather the issue in general. Why did you deem it necessary?
Well, it seemed to me, simply as a member of the public, because I came to ICAC without any prior knowledge of fighting corruption, but simply as a matter of, as a member of the public, it seemed to me that there were serious problems with lobbying. I'd spoken to some lobbyists, people who I knew and respected, and I could see that they were doing a job that facilitated the process of government, and I had spoken to politicians who said the same. But it also became apparent to me that there was a considerable amount of abuse of the lobbying process, and there were views on both sides very strongly held as to whether it was a good thing or a bad thing and what needed to be done to control it. So it seemed to me that the best way of doing this would be to have a public inquiry and to invite the experts throughout Australia to come and testify, and they did. We had former and current federal politicians, former and current state politicians, academics, lobbyists themselves, peak bodies of employers, trade unions, and we had video conferences with people in Canada who had recently conducted an inquiry of their own. And Corruption Prevention Division studied material from the United States and other countries, trying to put it together and take out the best we can for New South Wales. It seemed that was an expensive inquiry. We used a lot of our budget in doing this, but it did seem to me to be a really worthwhile task.
Could you take me through the key reforms that you recommend?
Well, there are two main prongs to the reforms. The one is that all meetings with ministers and senior bureaucrats should have some record of them, which should be open to public scrutiny. And by record, I mean the date of the meeting, those who attended, and the subject matter. That's the one leg. The other is to make sure that the information so recorded is subject to public scrutiny. So we wanted to make the process transparent. They also require a much more detailed register of lobbyists than at present takes place, and also require organisations that lobby to register as lobbyists. That is, not just individuals, but organisations like employer associations, trade unions, commercial companies who lobby, because a great deal of lobbying takes place direct by the companies themselves who don't employ professional lobbyists. So we wanted to make sure that lobbying of all kinds were covered, not just professional lobbyists. The point being that if you do regulate professional lobbyists, those who want to abuse the system, or even just keep secret the fact that they are lobbying, will just do the lobbying themselves, and that will not be subject to the regulation. So the recommendations that we made formed a full scheme designed to cover all this kind of lobbying in a practical way, but which would enable the public to see basically what had been done.
What of those reforms have been adopted?
Well, in the beginning, or so far, very few. The government has announced that it is going to introduce a number of the other recommendations, but has said that it is not going to introduce the recommendations in relation to employee lobbyists. I think that's very disappointing. There will just be a huge hole through which people who wish to abuse the system can pass. So I'm really disappointed in that.
Mr. Ip, you made particular reference in that report to dangers that exist where lobbying and political campaign contributions mix. What are those dangers?
Well, I think what you're talking about is donations. Now, political donations is a really difficult matter to deal with properly, because our system of democracy depends on contests between different political parties, and the only way they can fund themselves is by donations. So unless the donations are going to come from public funds, they have to get donations. The real problem arises when the donations are coupled with demands for favours. That means the donations are nothing less than bribes. Now, if the lobbying is controlled properly, the risk of harm through public donations will be lessened considerably. But if any of these recommendations are not adopted, then there'll be a real gap, and the issue of donations will not be affected. They'll remain as sinister as they do now.
Can you just reflect for a moment, as a result of your experiences, on how corrupt you think Australia, or at least Sydney, is?
Well, from the time I started until at the time I retired, I met and worked with New South Wales politicians who were independent, upright persons, dedicated to work for the public benefit, people of integrity. There was, however, a small group of people who had developed a culture of serious corruption. I regarded them during that time as a small minority who were damning unfairly the rest of the politicians. Since I've left, there have been further inquiries, which I've read about in the press, and the revelations in these are of a nature that now give me serious doubt as to what I regarded were the limits of corruption. And I don't know, because I did not attend the recent inquiry, and I have not read the evidence. I've read the reports and I've watched the television programs on the issue, and I think, like everyone else, one begins to fear that corruption might be far more widespread than was at first thought. I mean, one of the things that I think that the point that I would like to make is that corruption is really of two kinds. One is deliberate dishonesty, and that is the most serious, and there's nothing more to be said about that. But there is another kind, which involves behaviour which, when the politicians and public officials are first confronted with it, they say there's nothing wrong with it. So the corruption of this kind demonstrates a serious degree of ignorance or a lack of understanding as to what is corrupt conduct and what is not. And this does, I think, require education.
Is corruption just a New South Wales disease?
Oh, certainly not. As I say, to say that would be silly. I was in Perth during WA Inc. And corruption there was very similar to what has occurred here. And there is no other body in Australia like ICAC that has the same powers of investigation as ICAC. So ICAC is able to uncover corruption, which other bodies with similar names in other parts of Australia cannot uncover. Now, the fact that they can't uncover it doesn't allow persons honestly to say there's no corruption here. No one has picked up the rock in the other states to see what worms are crawling around underneath it.
There's been a constant flow of criticism about ICAC that it has failed insofar as there being so few successful criminal prosecutions. What do you say to those accusations?
Well, ICAC's statutory function, principal function, is not to have people prosecuted for corruption. It's to expose corruption. That's ICAC's job. And ICAC uses, as I've explained, evidence that's not admissible in criminal cases for many of its findings. Now, that doesn't mean to say that because there's no conviction that the person was not guilty of corrupt conduct. And the exposure of corrupt conduct is a very important factor. What happens in the inquiry is publicised to a great extent by the media, and it affects persons' reputations. And this was the whole purpose of the ICAC Act. That's what Parliament decided. They decided to set up an agency which will not have the power to prosecute itself, but will have the power to expose corruption. And that is exactly what ICAC is doing.
How would you defend the ICAC against allegations that it is simply besmirching the reputation of good people?
Well, I think first nominate the good person whose reputation is being besmirched. And I have the highest regard, actually, for Barry O'Farrell. And I was really sorry that he resigned because he was a strong supporter of ICAC and had provided it with resources in the way that I have earlier described. But he told an untruth to ICAC, and he had to resign. He thought that was appropriate. And many people would think that that's appropriate. That's not a trashing of reputations. I don't know what other reputations have been trashed that didn't deserve to be trashed.
Do you have an assessment as to how the public feels about the political process at the moment as a result of the exposure of the corruption on both sides of politics?
People feel very cynical. But my hope is that the political process will rectify itself and eradicate this, at least to a very substantial degree. That's essential for the proper governance of New South Wales. People have got to have confidence in the government. Otherwise, the end could be a failed state. And that would be extreme, of course, but that is the extreme end. It is really a bad thing for people not to have confidence in the government. But it does seem to me that in both parties, there's a genuine desire at leadership level to rectify things.
Because we operate on, I mean, trust is the lubricant of society. We have money in the bank, we assume it's going to come back out.
Yes.
What is the cost of a trust deficit?
Well, you ask the Prime Minister of Greece.
There are politicians who are reluctant to back meaningful reform of things like donation disclosures and integrity commissions. What message would you give them?
Well, I think they should see a psychologist.
Why?
Well, because it is so screamingly obvious that there is a breakdown in trust at the moment, and that the only way of maintaining trust or recovering the trust is to demonstrate that there are adequate means of discovering corruption so that the public can be confident that what the government is doing is not tainted by dishonest behaviour.